The sky was still sleeping when Mason Reed opened his eyes. That strange feeling that had awakened him persisted, like a silent call coming from somewhere beyond the walls of his small farmhouse. He breathed deeply, feeling the fresh morning air fill his lungs as he tried to decipher what it could be, perhaps just a persistent dream that insisted on accompanying him even after waking. At 55, Mason knew every inch of that land, as well as the lines on his own palms. Inherited from his father, the property in the Missouri Ozarks was his refuge and livelihood. It wasn't a large or luxurious farm, but it offered everything he needed: peace, space, and the occasional company of local animals that already considered him part of the landscape. He got up unhurriedly, put on his work clothes already worn by time, and stepped out onto the porch. Dew still covered the grass with its silvery gleam, and soft mist danced over the fields like a transparent veil. His footsteps were the only sounds breaking the silence of that special hour of the day, when night still hasn't completely gone away and day hesitates to arrive. Following his routine, he headed to the small barn where he kept his tools and some bales of hay. Since deciding to stop raising cattle and devote himself only to a small vegetable garden and a few animals, that space served more as storage than as shelter for herds. It was a simple life, but honest and peaceful. Mason turned the rusty old door handle and pushed open the barn door, which creaked in protest. That's when he heard it. A sound almost imperceptible, too small to be an intruder, but defined enough not to be just a product of his imagination. He sharpened his ears, trying to locate the source. It came from the darkest corner behind some stacked bales. Cautiously, he approached. He pushed aside one of the bales, and his heart nearly stopped with surprise. There, nestled in the hay, were 5 golden pups, trembling slightly. Their fur shimmered softly in the barn's dim light, with a coloration reminiscent of polished gold in the sun. At first glance, they looked like golden retriever puppies, with their floppy ears and pudgy bodies, but something seemed different. Their eyes, curiously alert for such young animals, watched him with a disconcerting intensity. There wasn't the typical enthusiasm of puppies, just a deep and almost conscious gaze. Mason looked around, searching for any sign of the mother. Nothing. No trace. No indication of how those little creatures could have arrived there. His farm was set back from the main road, isolated enough that any visit wouldn't go unnoticed. "How did you end up here?" he whispered, more to himself than to the puppies. One of them, slightly larger than the others, raised its head and looked him directly in the eyes, as if it understood the question. For a moment, Mason felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something almost human in that gaze. It wasn't time for questions without answers. Those little creatures needed care. He took off the old flannel jacket he was wearing and, with all the gentleness his calloused hands allowed, wrapped the puppies and took them inside. As he walked back, he couldn't help but notice how the sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. A new day, and something told him it would be the beginning of a completely unexpected story. The interior of Mason's house reflected the simplicity of its owner: old but well-preserved furniture, framed photos of times past, and a welcoming atmosphere that only true homes possess. He rarely received visitors beyond old Jim, who came once a month to bring supplies from town, and his niece Emily, who appeared during school vacations. Carefully, he placed the puppies on a rug near the wood stove, where the heat would provide comfort to the small creatures. They moved slowly, still trembling, observing Mason's every movement with those peculiar amber eyes. "You must be hungry," he murmured. While warming some milk in a pan, he prepared a mixture with the warm milk and placed it in 5 shallow dishes, positioning them close to the puppies. The little ones hesitated, their nostrils sniffing the air with curiosity. Finally, the boldest of the group, the same one that had looked directly at Mason in the barn, stepped forward. Trying to drink, it ended up stepping on the dish, spilling milk all over the rug. Mason smiled for the first time that morning. "Well, looks like you came to cause a little revolution around here, didn't you?" He spent the rest of the day improvising a comfortable area for the puppies. He used old wooden boxes, soft blankets, and even built a small fence to delimit the space. He observed how they interacted with each other. There was a surprising coordination in their movements, almost as if they followed a silent code that only they understood. At night, while preparing a simple soup for himself, he felt a gaze upon him. The lead puppy was there, sitting at the kitchen entrance, watching him with that disconcerting intensity. "What is it?" asked Mason. "Still hungry?" The puppy tilted its head slightly as if trying to understand the words. Then, to Mason's amazement, it cautiously approached and sat down beside him, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly choosing his company. It was at that moment that Mason realized there was something special about these animals. It wasn't just the unusual behavior or those disturbingly intelligent eyes. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. In the days that followed, his quiet house was completely transformed. The puppies, still quiet by normal canine standards, began to explore the environment with methodical curiosity. There wasn't the typical chaos of playful puppies. Instead, there seemed to be a purpose in every movement, every investigation. They were also growing rapidly, too rapidly. Their slender bodies lost the chubby shape typical of puppies and developed an almost wild elegance. The fur, once soft and golden like that of golden retrievers, became thicker and took on a deeper tone, with nuances reminiscent of polished copper under certain lights. It was in the second week that Mason noticed another peculiarity. They never barked. Not a single bark, whine, or growl. Their silence was absolute, as if they communicated with each other by some means imperceptible to human ears. One afternoon, while feeding his chickens, Mason noticed the absence of the lead puppy, which he had secretly begun to call Amber due to the color of its eyes. Concerned, he put down the feed bucket and began searching the property, calling softly. The sun was beginning to set when he finally found it near the small spring that ran at the back of the property. Amber was motionless, its paws firmly planted on the ground, eyes fixed on the line of trees further ahead. It didn't move when Mason approached, just maintained that silent vigilance. "What are you seeing there, boy?" whispered Mason, kneeling beside it. In response, Amber merely turned to him briefly, its eyes reflecting the last ray of sunlight of the day, and then calmly returned towards the house, as if it had completed some important task. Mason remained there for a moment, looking at the forest and then at the already distant figure of Amber. An inexplicable certainty began to form in his heart. These weren't ordinary animals, and the mystery of their origin began to intrigue him more and more. Mornings on Mason's farm had gained a new rhythm. He now woke up not only to the crowing of roosters, but also to the silent presence of 5 pairs of attentive eyes that seemed to patiently wait for him to awaken. It was as if they understood the human routine and adapted to it with a surprising comprehension. 3 weeks had passed since the discovery in the barn, and the changes in the puppies were impossible to ignore. They now reached the height of Mason's knees, an extraordinary growth for such young animals. Their bodies had completely lost the appearance of puppies and taken on an elongated and muscular form, with large, powerful paws. The fur, increasingly dense, now had a complex pattern of golden and reddish tones that shone under the sunlight like liquid fire. But it was their behaviors that most fascinated Mason. They began to go out during the day, exploring the property in organized formations, always led by Amber. They hunted small rodents with impressive efficiency, but never approached the chickens or other farm animals. It was as if they understood the unspoken rules of the place. During these weeks, Mason tried several times to find out if anyone in the region had lost puppies. He asked old Jim, who knew all the residents within a 20-mile radius, but no one had reported such a loss. Besides, the more he observed his new companions, the more convinced he became that these weren't ordinary dogs. "You're quite the mystery," he commented one night, sitting on the porch while observing the 5 animals arranged in a semicircle on the front lawn, like silent sentinels contemplating the horizon. As always, there was no response beyond attentive looks. But Mason had grown accustomed to this. In fact, he found comfort in that shared silence, a form of communication that transcended words. It was during the 4th week that the first truly disturbing incident occurred. Mason was fixing the fence on the eastern side of the property when he heard a strange noise coming from the woods. Before he could react, he saw Amber and the other 4 emerge from the vegetation in a perfect defensive formation, blocking the path between Mason and the source of the noise. Suddenly, an adult wild boar burst through the trees, its sharp tusks gleaming threateningly. It was a huge animal, easily capable of seriously injuring a human. Mason froze, knowing he couldn't reach his tools in time. What happened next was etched in his memory forever. Without emitting a single sound, the 5 animals moved in perfect synchrony. They didn't directly attack the boar. Instead, they executed a series of calculated movements that confused the animal. Amber positioned itself to attract its attention while the others circled strategically. The boar hesitated, clearly confused by the tactic. Then, as if obeying a silent command, it turned around and disappeared back into the woods. Mason remained paralyzed for a few moments, trying to process what he had just witnessed. When he finally recovered his voice, he slowly approached his protectors. You protected me," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Amber turned to him, and for the first time Mason was absolutely certain that he saw understanding in those eyes. The 5 animals stayed close to him for the rest of the day, as if they wanted to ensure his safety. That night, lying in his bed, Mason confronted the reality he had been trying to ignore. These animals weren't just different, they were extraordinary. They possessed an intelligence that defied comprehension and abilities that seemed almost supernatural in their coordination and efficiency. The curiosity that consumed him was no longer just about where they came from, but what exactly they were, and why, of all possible places, they had appeared in his barn on that misty morning that now seemed to have happened in another lifetime. One thing was certain: it wasn't a coincidence, and as sleep finally reached him, Mason felt that he was at the center of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. The months of May and June brought the first heavy rains, and with them, even deeper changes in the behavior of the mysterious animals. Mason had already given up calling them puppies. They were majestic creatures now, almost the height of adult wolves, but with a more elegant and agile constitution. Their nocturnal habits intensified. Often, Mason would wake up in the middle of the night and find them absent, only to see them returning at dawn with that same silent coordination that so intrigued him. On these mornings, he noticed small changes in the territory around the farm, subtle trails that didn't exist before, markings on trees that seemed to establish some kind of invisible perimeter. One of these mornings, Mason decided to follow them. He woke up before sunrise and, maintaining a respectful distance, accompanied the 5 animals on their morning journey. They traversed the property in a specific pattern, as if they were conducting a carefully planned patrol. Occasionally, they would stop, sniff the air, and exchange those looks that seemed to contain entire conversations. It was during this observation that Mason noticed something truly astonishing. The animals were effectively patrolling, but not just that. They were protecting not only him, but the entire local ecosystem. He saw how they gently diverted small animals away from natural traps, how they organized alternative routes for smaller creatures when they detected larger predators in the vicinity. "Your guardians," murmured Mason, feeling a lump in his throat. As if in response, Amber turned directly to him, even while being at a considerable distance. Their eyes met across the space that separated them, and Mason felt that inexplicable connection that had been growing between them. It wasn't like the relationship between a human and a pet. It was something deeper, based on mutual respect, and something that, if it weren't so impossible, he would call shared understanding. The following days brought other signs that continued to feed Mason's growing sense of being in the presence of something extraordinary. Small events that, in isolation, could be dismissed as coincidences, but together formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Like the morning he found his gardening tools carefully organized after having left them scattered the night before, or when he woke up to discover that the leak in the porch roof, which had been bothering him for weeks, had been signaled by the strategic presence of small stones arranged directly under the leakage point. The most significant event, however, occurred on a rainy afternoon at the end of June. Mason was checking the level of the small creek that cut through his property, concerned about the possibility of flooding due to the intense rains of the past few weeks. He reached the bank and found that, indeed, the water had risen dangerously. As he contemplated the problem, he felt a presence beside him. Amber, completely soaked by the rain, was looking not at the creek, but at a specific point further ahead. Mason followed his gaze and realized what had caught the animal's attention: a pile of branches and debris that was starting to form a natural dam, blocking the normal flow of water. If it continued like this, the water would be redirected straight to the crop fields, destroying months of work. "How did you know?" asked Mason, but Amber was already moving. What happened next defied everything Mason believed to be possible. With perfect coordination, the 5 animals began to work on the obstruction, not just randomly pushing, but strategically removing certain branches, creating alternative channels for water passage, reinforcing specific points that would keep the remaining structure in place. It was engineering work, intelligent and calculated work, Mason helped as he could, but most of the time he just watched, amazed. In less than an hour, the creek's flow had been restored to a safe pattern, and his fields were protected. Soaked to the bone, but with his heart full of admiration, Mason looked at his companions. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing that words would never be enough. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of hot tea between his hands, Mason began to write in an old notebook everything he had observed in the past few months. Each unusual behavior, each demonstrated ability, each moment of inexplicable connection. When he finished, he looked at the filled pages and felt a chill run down his spine. What he had documented were not characteristics of known animals. They were abilities that transcended common understanding. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind, an idea as extraordinary as it was terrifying in its implications. What if these weren't just rare or unknown animals? What if they were something more? The answer would come sooner than he expected. July brought clearer skies and the typical dry heat of the region. The routine on the farm had found a new balance, with Mason and his mysterious companions establishing a harmonious dynamic based on mutual respect and silent cooperation. It was on one of these sunny mornings that the distant rumble of an engine broke the usual tranquility. Mason was in the yard, sorting seeds for planting, when the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching by the dirt road caught his attention. Visits were rare, especially unannounced ones. A dark green Jeep appeared around the bend in the road, raising dust as it approached the house. Mason didn't immediately recognize the vehicle, but when it stopped and the driver got out, an involuntary smile appeared on his face. It was Dr. Nathan, the county veterinarian who attended to the farms in the region, a middle-aged man with thick-rimmed glasses and an eternal air of scientific curiosity. "Mason, how are you, my friend?" greeted Nathan, approaching with a firm handshake. "Dr. Nathan, what a surprise. Is everything okay?" Yes. I'm making routine visits in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how things are going here. It's been more than 6 months since I last came to check on your animals." As they talked, Mason noticed out of the corner of his eye how his 5 companions had strategically positioned themselves at the edge of the woods, almost invisible among the vegetation, but clearly observing every movement of the visitor. "I don't have many animals to check this time, Doctor. Just the chickens and 2 horses." Nathan nodded, but his gaze had already caught the golden silhouettes half hidden in the distance. "And those over there?" he asked, pointing discreetly. "Are they new? They look like hunting dogs." By their posture, Mason hesitated. It was the first time someone other than him had seen the mysterious animals. For months, they had stayed away from any other human who occasionally visited the property, as if they understood the need to remain hidden. "Actually, they showed up here. I found them in the barn a few months ago." Nathan's professional curiosity was immediately piqued. "Found them? Abandoned puppies?" His eyes narrowed as he tried to get a better look at the animals in the distance. "May I take a look at them? As a veterinarian, I should check if they're healthy." Before Mason could respond, Nathan was already walking toward the animals, his scientific enthusiasm evident. Mason followed him, a bit apprehensive. As they approached, he expected the animals to retreat into the woods, as they always did in the presence of strangers. To his surprise, they remained motionless, as if they were assessing the situation. It was Amber who stepped forward, separating from the group. Its eyes fixed not on Mason but directly on Nathan, with that disturbing intensity that Mason knew so well. The veterinarian stopped abruptly. "My God," he whispered, adjusting his glasses as if he didn't believe what he was seeing. "Mason, do you have any idea what these animals are?" The question hung in the air like a slowly falling leaf. Mason felt his heart race. Finally, perhaps, the moment had come to discover the truth. "I was hoping you could tell me." Nathan took a hesitant step forward, his professional gaze analyzing every detail of the animals that now arranged themselves in a semicircular formation, allowing a clear view but maintaining a safe distance. "May I get closer?" asked Nathan, addressing not Mason but directly to Amber, as if intuitively recognizing that permission should come from it. To the astonishment of both men, Amber slightly inclined its head in a gesture that seemed unmistakably an agreement. Nathan advanced carefully, his movements slow and respectful. He stopped a few meters away and observed for a long time, his face transitioning from curiosity to amazement and then to a kind of reverence. "Mason," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "These aren't ordinary dogs. They're not even dogs, to be honest. What are they then?" Nathan took a deep breath before answering, as if organizing his thoughts. "From what I can observe of the morphology, coat pattern, and, more importantly, the behavior I'm witnessing, these are specimens of Chrysoceon brachyurus." Seeing Mason's confused expression, Nathan clarified, "Maned wolves, a native species of the South American grasslands, extremely rare in North America and protected by law. They're known as maned wolves due to those longer erect hairs on the nape." Mason felt as if the ground were moving beneath his feet. "Maned wolves? But they don't look like the images I've seen." "That's part of the mystery." Nathan adjusted his glasses again, studying the animals with growing fascination. They have physical characteristics of maned wolves, but with significant variations. The coloration is more golden, the constitution more robust, and the social behavior is completely atypical. Maned wolves are primarily solitary, but these are clearly functioning as a cohesive unit. Nathan took a few more steps, always under Amber's watchful gaze. "And there's something else. The intelligence they demonstrate." He paused as if hesitating to vocalize such improbable thoughts. "Mason, for God's sake, how did you manage this? Maned wolves are practically ghosts in nature. They're elusive, almost impossible to be spotted, much less socialized in this way." Mason told the whole story: the discovery in the barn, the accelerated growth, the extraordinary behaviors he had witnessed in the past few months. Nathan listened attentively, occasionally casting looks of amazement at the animals that remained observing the conversation with apparent understanding. "This is unprecedented," concluded Nathan, when Mason finished his account. "What you've described goes beyond documented animal behavior for this species. The way they protect the territory, how they solve the creek problem." He shook his head, amazed. "If I weren't seeing it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it." It was at this moment that Amber approached even closer. Stopping just a few steps from Nathan, the veterinarian remained still, respecting that moment of assessment. Then, in a gesture that drew exclamations of surprise from both men, Amber extended its right paw, as if offering a formal greeting. Nathan looked at Mason, who nodded encouragingly, as astonished as the veterinarian. Carefully, Nathan extended his hand and gently touched the offered paw. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "Absolutely extraordinary." The sun was beginning to set when Nathan finally prepared to leave. The quick visit had turned into an entire afternoon of observations, notes, and discussions about possible explanations for the phenomenon they were witnessing. "Mason, what you have here is something that science needs to know about. However," he hesitated, looking at the animals that now rested peacefully near the porch, as if they had completely accepted his presence. "However, we need to proceed with extreme caution. Rare species like this are frequent targets of illegal hunters and unscrupulous collectors." Mason felt a tightness in his chest at the thought of any threat to his companions. "What do you suggest then?" "There's a conservation project led by the State University. They work exclusively with endangered species of the American plains, including research on maned wolves. I personally know the coordinator, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She's discreet, competent, and above all committed to animal welfare." Mason pondered for a moment, observing his 5 companions. The idea of sharing his secret with more people made him apprehensive, but he knew he needed to think about what was best for them. "All right, but I want to be present at all times, and they stay here where they're safe, until we decide the best path." Nathan nodded, understanding the protection Mason felt. "Agreed. I'll contact her discreetly and return in a few days if that's okay with you." As the jeep drove away down the dirt road, Mason sat on the porch steps, feeling a mix of emotions. Relief at finally having some idea about the identity of his companions, but also apprehension about what the future might bring. Amber approached silently and sat beside him, its warm body a comforting presence against the approaching night. Mason extended his hand and gently stroked the golden fur, now knowing that he was caressing one of the rarest and most extraordinary creatures on the planet. And a question continued to echo in his mind. Of all the places in the world, why had they chosen his barn to appear? The week following Dr. Nathan's visit passed with an air of anticipation. Mason found himself checking the dirt road more frequently, a mixture of excitement and anxiety brewing within him at the thought of what the promised visit might reveal. True to his word, Nathan returned the following Friday, this time accompanied by a woman whose appearance immediately impressed Mason. Dr. Sarah Mitchell looked to be in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around her. Her practical field clothes and the way she carried herself suggested someone who spent more time in nature than in laboratories. "Mr. Reed," she greeted with a firm handshake, "I'm Sarah Mitchell. Nathan has told me about your extraordinary guests, although I must admit I came with a healthy dose of skepticism." Mason appreciated her honesty. "They tend to have that effect, Dr. Mitchell. Shall we?" "They're usually down by the creek this time of day." The three walked in companionable silence across the property. As they approached the creek, Mason noticed Dr. Mitchell's stride slow, her body language shifting from professional politeness to genuine awe. There, by the water's edge, the five-maned wolves were engaged in what appeared to be a coordinated fishing exercise, with two stirring the shallows while the others waited downstream to catch the disoriented fish. "Good Lord," Sarah whispered, instinctively reaching for her notebook. This is cooperative hunting. Maned wolves don't do this. They're solitary hunters." Mason nodded. "That's just the beginning of what makes them special." For the next 2 hours, they observed from a respectful distance. Sarah took copious notes, occasionally murmuring to herself or asking a quiet question. When Amber finally acknowledged their presence and led the group toward them, Mason felt a surge of pride at Dr. Mitchell's barely contained excitement. "They're coming to us? Voluntarily?" she asked, her voice a mixture of scientific curiosity and childlike wonder. "They know you're here to help," Mason replied simply. What followed was a series of gentle introductions. Sarah kept her movements slow and deliberate, respecting the animal's space. When Amber extended the same poor greeting it had offered Nathan, Sarah's professional composure momentarily cracked. "Incredible," she breathed, "the level of cognitive function this suggests." Back at the house over cups of coffee, Sarah shared her insights. "Based on what I've observed and what Nathan has told me, these animals represent something we've never documented before. They exhibit behaviors that blur the line between instinct and intelligence in a way that's unprecedented." "But what are they exactly?" Mason pressed. "Nathan mentioned maned wolves, but..." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Genetically, they appear to be maned wolves, yes, but there's something else going on here. Their coloration, their social structure, their problem-solving abilities. It's as if they've undergone some evolutionary leap." "Could they be some kind of hybrid?" Nathan suggested. "Possibly, but that wouldn't explain the intelligence factor," Sarah replied. "What I can tell you is that these creatures represent an incredible opportunity for conservation. The maned wolf population has been declining steadily due to habitat loss. Whatever these animals are, they clearly have adaptive capabilities that could be crucial for the species' survival." Mason felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved to be getting answers. On the other, he felt a growing concern about what these revelations might mean for his companions. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Sarah set down her coffee cup, her expression serious but kind. "With your permission, I'd like to conduct a non-invasive study. Observation only, no capture, no tagging, just documentation of their behaviors and perhaps some environmental DNA samples to help us understand their genetic makeup better." She paused, then added, "But Mason, I want to be clear about something. What you've done here, providing these animals a safe haven, allowing them to thrive, it's remarkable. Whatever path we take forward needs to honor that relationship and ensure their continued well-being." Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you for understanding that." As the conversation continued into the evening, plans were made. Sarah would return with minimal equipment, just cameras and collection vials for environmental samples. The study would be kept confidential, known only to a small, trusted team. After the visitors departed, Mason returned to the porch, where his 5 companions had gathered as if sensing the importance of the day's events. Amber approached, resting its head briefly against Mason's knee in an unprecedented display of affection. "Well," Mason said softly, "looks like we're going to be part of something important." As the stars appeared overhead, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to this story, that the biggest revelation was yet to come. The gentle rhythm of summer gave way to the first crisp days of autumn. For 2 months, Dr. Mitchell and her small team had been making regular visits to the farm, setting up non-invasive monitoring equipment and collecting data. Their presence had become a familiar part of life on the farm, and to Mason's surprise, the wolves seemed to accept the researchers almost as readily as they had accepted him. It was on a golden October afternoon that Sarah arrived alone, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Mason knew immediately that something significant had happened. "The results came back from the lab," she said without preamble, as Mason offered her a seat on the porch. "Mason, I hardly know how to explain what we've found." Mason sat down beside her, heart racing. "Just tell me, are they okay?" "They're more than okay," Sarah replied, opening her laptop. "The DNA analysis shows something that turns everything we know about canid evolution on its head." She turned the screen toward him, displaying charts and sequences that meant little to Mason's untrained eye. "In simple terms, your wolves possess genetic markers that we've only seen in ancient canid DNA, recovered from specimens that lived over 30,000 years ago." Mason blinked, trying to process this. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Sarah said carefully, "that they represent either an incredibly preserved ancient lineage that somehow avoided detection by science for millennia, or, Mason prompted when she hesitated, "or they're the result of something beyond our current scientific understanding." She looked him directly in the eyes. "Mason, these animals possess cognitive abilities that match or exceed those of our closest primate relatives. The problem-solving tests we've conducted remotely place them in a category we don't even have a name for yet." Mason looked out at the field where the 5 wolves were currently engaged in what appeared to be a coordinated patrol of the property perimeter. "I've known they were special from the first day," he said softly. "But this is revolutionary," Sarah finished for him, "and it gets more extraordinary. We've been analyzing their communication patterns. The silent coordination you've observed isn't just body language. There are subtle vocalizations happening just outside the range of human hearing. They're quite literally talking to each other, Mason." A chill ran down his spine. "All this time?" "Yes, and there's more." Sarah's voice dropped almost to a whisper, as if she herself couldn't believe what she was about to say. "The timing of their appearance here, their choice of location. It wasn't random." Mason turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled out a map from her bag, unfolding it on the small table between them. "This is a conservation survey from 15 years ago. Your farm sits exactly at the center of what was once a critical wildlife corridor, before development fragmented the surrounding habitat." She pointed to various marked areas. "These were all connected once, allowing species to migrate and maintain genetic diversity. Now they're islands, and the wildlife populations within them are slowly declining due to isolation." Mason stared at the map, a dawning realization making his heart beat faster. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that your 5 wolves appeared at precisely the location where they could make the biggest difference in reversing the fragmentation pattern. The behavioral changes we've documented in other local wildlife since their arrival, the new movement patterns, the return of species not seen in this area for decades, it all points to something deliberate." Mason sat back, stunned. "They're healers," he said finally. "They're healing the land." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's exactly what they're doing. And they chose you, Mason. They chose this place, and they chose you to help them do it." As the implications of Sarah's words sank in, Mason felt a presence and looked up to find Amber standing before them, its intelligent eyes moving between the 2 humans, as if following their conversation. For the first time since their arrival, Mason felt he truly understood the depth of the connection between himself and these extraordinary creatures. They weren't just animals that had wandered onto his property by chance. They were guardians, entrusted with a mission that spanned far beyond what he could have imagined, and somehow, incomprehensibly, they had selected him to be part of that mission. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the farm, Mason knew that nothing would ever be the same again. A new chapter was beginning, not just for him, but for the land itself. The world transformed with the seasons, and Mason's farm transformed with it. What had once been a quiet, somewhat lonely homestead became the center of something remarkable, a pioneering conservation effort unlike any before it. With careful planning and the utmost discretion, Sarah's team had established a unique sanctuary that extended beyond the boundaries of Mason's property. Neighboring landowners, initially skeptical but eventually won over by the undeniable positive changes they witnessed in the local ecosystem, agreed to participate in creating wildlife corridors that reconnected fragmented habitats. The golden wolves, as they came to be called among the small circle of people aware of their existence, served as both inspiration and active participants in the restoration. They seemed to innately understand the purpose of each new conservation measure, often appearing at precisely the right locations to guide other wildlife through newly established passages or to deter them from dangerous areas. On a crisp December morning, almost a year to the day since he had discovered the pups in his barn, Mason stood on his porch watching a remarkable scene unfold. A family of deer, species that had become increasingly rare in the area, cautiously made their way across his eastern field. Amber and two of the others maintained a respectful distance, not hunting, but seemingly escorting the deer toward a newly established protected corridor. "They never cease to amaze me," Sarah said, joining Mason on the porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Mason accepted his gratefully. "Do you think we'll ever fully understand them?" Sarah smiled. "Maybe not fully, but I think that's the beauty of it. They remind us that there's still mystery in the world, still things beyond our complete understanding, and maybe that's exactly what we need right now." Mason nodded, watching as Amber completed the escort mission and turned back toward the house. In the year since their arrival, the golden wolves had grown into their full maturity. They were magnificent creatures now, with thick golden coats that gleamed like burnished metal in the winter sunlight, and an undeniable presence that commanded respect without inspiring fear. "The latest wildlife survey data is remarkable," Sarah continued, pulling a tablet from her bag. "Species diversity up 37% across the region. Water quality in the streams improved. Even soil samples show higher nutrient content. It's as if they're accelerating the healing," Mason finished. "Not just allowing it, but actively driving it forward." "Exactly, and the scientific community is starting to take notice, even with the limited information we've released." Sarah had been careful about how much she shared with her colleagues, revealing enough to secure conservation funding and support without exposing the full truth about the wolves' unique nature. A comfortable silence fell between them as they observed Amber approaching. The lead wolf had developed a particular connection with Mason over the months, a bond that transcended ordinary animal-human relationships. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Mason could almost feel thoughts that weren't his own. Impressions, intentions, a sense of purpose that seemed to flow between them like an invisible current. "I had a strange dream last night," Mason said suddenly. "I saw a vast landscape changing over time, forests growing and retreating, animals evolving and adapting, and through it all, golden figures moving like guardians, appearing where they were needed most." He looked down at Amber, who had settled at his feet. "It didn't feel like a dream, it felt like a memory, but not mine." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "The indigenous peoples of this continent have stories about guardian spirits that take animal form, protectors of the land that appear when the balance of nature is threatened." She glanced at Amber. "Perhaps some myths have more truth to them than we've been willing to acknowledge." As the winter sun climbed higher, they were interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. The monthly meeting of what Sarah had dubbed the Corridor Initiative was about to begin. A gathering of neighboring landowners, conservation experts, and the small team of scientists privy to the full scope of the project. "Ready for this?" Sarah asked. Mason nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The meeting unfolded in Mason's renovated barn, now serving as both a research station and community gathering place. Maps were spread across tables, data presented, and plans discussed. The golden wolves remained just outside, visible through the open doors, but maintaining a respectful distance from the larger group. "The eastern corridor is now fully functional," reported Mark Taylor, a rancher from the adjacent property who had initially been the most skeptical of the project. "I've seen more wildlife movement in the past 3 months than in the previous 10 years, and water quality in the connecting streams continues to improve," added Dr. Jensen, a hydrologist from the university. "Whatever you folks are doing here, it's working." As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Mason found himself standing alone at the edge of his property, looking out over the land that had transformed so dramatically under his stewardship. He felt a presence beside him and knew without looking that Amber had joined him. "We did good, didn't we?" he said softly. In response, Amber pressed gently against his side, a rare and precious gesture of affection. As Mason placed his hand on the wolf's warm fur, he felt something pass between them that needed no words. Gratitude, partnership, and a shared vision for the future. That evening, after everyone had departed, Mason sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. All 5 wolves were gathered on the lawn, their golden coats catching the last light of day. For creatures of such power and mystery, they looked remarkably at peace. Sarah's parting words echoed in his mind. What's happening here isn't just about conservation, Mason. It's about remembering something we've forgotten, that we're not separate from nature. We're part of it. These extraordinary beings are teaching us how to remember that connection. As darkness fell and stars appeared overhead, Mason reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with 5 small puppies in his barn. He had always thought of himself as a simple man living a quiet life, but fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, had chosen him for this remarkable partnership. Whatever the future held, whatever mysteries still remained about his golden companions, one thing was certain: together, they were creating something beautiful, a healed land, a restored balance, a bridge between the human world and the wild one that had always existed just beyond our understanding. And in a world increasingly disconnected from nature, perhaps that was the most important mission of all. The 5 wolves rose as one and moved closer to the porch, forming a semicircle around Mason, as they had done so many times before. Amber looked up at him, those remarkable amber eyes reflecting the starlight, filled with an intelligence and awareness that still took Mason's breath away. In that moment, Mason understood that some bonds transcend species, time, and even understanding. Some connections are formed not because they make sense, but because they are necessary, for healing, for growth, for hope. And sometimes, the most extraordinary guardians come to us in ways we could never expect, teaching us that we too have a role to play in protecting this precious world we share. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change the course of an entire ecosystem, and in that change, we might just find our own true purpose. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.